mean, there's literally a linguistic barrier between the two of you. There's a wall between you two, and you actually misunderstand what the other says. And that happened frequently in my life. I think as the United States becomes more multicultural and people are learning to adapt more, I even wonder if it will eventually result in a new common, standardization. Standard dialect might reemerge. Of course, academic English will likely stay by and large the same, but a new standard dialect might emerge semi-formally. That's speculation, though. But what is certain is that sometimes we'll meet people with different dialects. Sometimes they will use the exact same words, because in some dialects the English is very different. Like you think, you hear like wagwan, big up. You might hear Jamaican vernacular English, some Jamaican dialect. You might hear some sub-dialect of African American vernacular English. Like what it do, fam? Somebody who has no familiarity with AAVE dialects, especially if they're not familiar with that particular sub-dialect. Someone says, "What it do, fam?" They might have no idea what they're saying. Someone says, "Wagwan," they don't know what's going on. Doesn't sound like that to a lot of people who aren't familiar with it. If someone says, "I'm low bat," what is "I'm low bat"? That's Filipino English. That's one of the dialects or sub-dialects. If you say "I'm low bat," it means I have a low battery, probably in reference to my phone or tablet, but probably phone. I'm low bat means I have a low battery. Wagwan in Jamaican, some Jamaican dialects. What's going on? Like in Filipino English. When I was in the Philippines a couple times, you'll hear different English things. One other thing was another common thing they'll say is my nose is bleeding. Well, I look at them, their nose isn't bleeding. Well, why do people keep saying my nose is bleeding? They're not saying their nose is literally bleeding. It's a Filipino common vernacular English way of saying you're speaking in another language, probably English, far too fast for me to understand what you're saying. So if you're speaking in English too fast, in their vernacular of English, if you're speaking to them in English too fast for them to understand, they will, or it's difficult for them to understand what you're saying, they will say my nose is bleeding. Obviously, their nose will 99.999% of the time not be bleeding, but it just means you're speaking English too fast. As you can see, these different dialects and various sub-dialects of English, because you could even argue that African American vernacular English is by and large a sub-dialect of the larger group of Southern Common Vernacular English, which has a lot of sub-dialects and sub-dialects within the sub-dialects, right? Potentially, at least. And you have Canadian Common Vernacular dialects of English, and Maryland, and Pennsylvania, and Virginia, California, Texas, and so on and so forth. Just in the United States, and just in certain cities, like Baltimore City, you'll have certain sub-dialects of English, quite a few of them. And some of those sub-dialects are largely unique to, or at least native, endemic to Baltimore City, and so on and so forth. You go in the world and you see these different, how you doing? How you doing? Dominguez, ¿cómo estás? You go around the world and you see these different English dialects, and with that apellido, that surname there, the same is true for Spanish as well. But English is the one I've had the most exposure to, and sometimes there'll be some dialects, and you'll think they might be speaking some form of common vernacular American English, which they probably are. In the case I'm thinking of, or the kind of cases I'm thinking of, but it's like a sub-dialect you're not familiar with. And they're using the same words that you're used to hearing in your common vernacular form of English, but say it's from let's say it's from maybe not Nebraska, but let's say it's from one of the middle American states, and you're on the East Coast, and you use the same words, but the words have different connotations, different implications, different meanings. There are different anecdotes and different expressions that they use to mean different things, and it confuses the person. Oh, I like that. 6, 7. Oh, you silly goose. 7, 8. But yeah, that'll happen that with some people, where you'll have two people who use the similar words, like they might use like words like gonna, short for going to, and like been and had, and a lot of the words I'm using right now. And in their common vernacular form of English, though, the anecdotes, the expressions, the things that they say to mean something else are very different, and it confuses people oftentimes in this first encounter because they're not used to it. You see that in other cultures, like in Jewish culture, like in the New Testament, you'll see a lot of stuff that if you're not familiar with like Hebrew history, you'll get lost potentially in what the actual meaning seems to be, or the deeper meaning seems to be. It's so cultural, and so you can speak the same language and have no idea what's going on, especially if you take it at face value a lot of times. When it comes to the way people use common vernacular English, here's an example. Someone, you might ask someone, are you going into work today? And someone might say something like, does the sun revolve around the earth? As a way to say no. They might pick a way to express themselves. There are plenty of different dialects. People have different ways of expressing themselves that people who speak other dialects just won't understand, even if they're using the exact same words and abbreviated, expressions, etc. Or at least, not abbreviated expressions. If they're using the same words, even when it comes to like AAVE, some people might say. Some people might say, what's up, cuz? Some people might say, what it do? There are a lot of different ways to introduce oneself, and not all dialects share the same kinds of introductions or the same kind of thank yous in dialects like AAB, right? Potentially, right? You have like appreciate it without the A, just appreciate it for, thank you, right? And some people will say thank you in some dialects, some people in some dialects will say thanks. You might even hear some sub-dialects where they might say things like TY, It might seem goofy to people who don't speak those dialects, but, for native speakers who are immersed in this, who grew up in it, it's just life. They're surrounded by that. Maybe in their family, maybe in their school environment, maybe in a number of environments, growing up, even as adults, etc. They're immersed in these dialects. And, I think some people were arguing that Shetlandic was a form of English, an English dialect. I think that's a gross exaggeration of how we look at language variation, because I wouldn't call Shetlandic an English dialect. But let's analyze part of a poem that I have memorized. We gung to the kirk and ye were alms, we say were prayers and sing were songs. Well, and when a horse is blinded and mourn to death, we visit the folk and we send a ref. Sure, a lot of people recognize some of those words. People did not recognize all of those words. And they used the word barn in that poem. She uses the word barn in that poem. Well, what does barn mean? Barn means children. Barn means children. Well, most English speakers won't pick up on that. And if we consider like Shetlandic to be some sort of dialect of English, then that does open up some other things. And of course, you can kind of say similar things about like Jamaican vernacular English. Sure, you can recognize certain words if you're not a native speaker and you speak another English dialect, but a lot of it is just going to go over your head because some dialects are so vastly different. I think that's true for some variations of African American vernacular English, but not all. Definitely not all. A lot of them are more recognizable than others, depending on the sub-dialect. What's up, Emily? And, I need to breathe for a second. I can't talk nonstop the whole time, but it'll only give me a second or two. I need to breathe. Australian common vernacular English, or even Australian standard, standard Australian English, and or even like standard American English, which is the golden standard for academia, or the Queen's English in Great Britain. England English, that's where English comes from. Comes from the tribe, the Angles. You have the Angles, the Sacs, the Jutes, and the Angles, Angleland, the land of the Angles, Anglish. That's where we get those words. Angle land, the land of the tribe of the Angles, and then you had Anglish because it was the language of the Angles. It was Anglish. Just like you have Spanish, the language of the Spaniards and of Spain. Italian, the language of Italy and the Italians. Hebrew, the language of the Hebrews. It's pretty self-evident, but there's a lot of distance between the Angles and Angleland and Anglish and our modern understanding, of those origins. And the origins are pretty ancient, and since English in particular has had such a rough and rugged history and a very diversified history, unlike other languages, a lot of things get lost in translation, so to speak. It's very unique among the languages. English went from using the alphabet of the Angles to a combination of the native alphabet, the runic alphabet, a combination of that and the Latin alphabet, or the Latin alphabet at that particular time, which already seems to have had major alterations from the original Latin, but using the Latin alphabet of that time, so to speak, with some adaptations to not make it 100% the Latin alphabet anymore, but we still call it the Latin alphabet. So it went from essentially the native runic alphabet, the English alphabet, to the Latin alphabet with some letters from the runic alphabet, because the Latin alphabet didn't have letters for sounds like the, so they borrowed one of the letters from the English alphabet for the. They didn't have a letter for wa. Well, they did in older Latin usage, but at that point in time, they borrowed the English letter for the wa sound. At least at the time, at least when Beowulf was written, that happened. If you look at the original manuscript. And I think it was like 3 letters they borrowed from the runic alphabet for Beowulf, at least, to make the sounds that the Latin alphabet they were using didn't have letters for, seemingly. And then some of the runes seem to have gotten dropped. Letters like you had W, 2 U's put together. U and V used to be the same letter, then they were split into 2 different letters. And then there was the borrowing of X, Y, and Z from the Greek alphabet. So over the years, the English alphabet had English letters, then it was English and Latin letters, then it was Latin and new letters and Greek letters. And then we have a lot of borrow loan words. We have words from German, from Spanish, from Arabic, from Sanskrit, and so on. We borrow so many words from other languages in English. English has a very complicated, very diversified history. And not to mention like the dialects of English that you see in like India too. When some of dialects, look at Indian common vernaculars of English. A lot of people who speak English in their native dialect or dialects have no comprehension of someone speaking Indian common vernacular English. And so on and so forth. Jamaican common vernacular English, Australian common vernacular English dialects, African American vernacular English dialects, and other Southern common vernacular English dialects, and so on and so forth. Filipino common vernacular English dialects, and just the list goes on. And even somebody from like Ohio and someone from Maryland might have extreme misunderstandings about very basic things when they communicate to each other. So like going back to what I was saying before, there are different words, there are different phonemes or sounds, there are different expressions, there are different ways of expressing oneself, there are different ways of applying things like anecdotes and metaphor and simile and different ways of expressing oneself in like non-literal ways and so on and so forth. Because we don't typically use 100% literal language in common vernacular dialects. That kind of hyper-literalism is often associated more or utilized more so in like standard national forms of English, like standard American English. And even in those vernaculars of English, they're not always 100% literal 100% of the time. And with that in mind, and with the variety of cultural influences, like Louisiana common vernacular forms of English, and so on and so forth, Canada, etc., California, and with that in mind, Baltimore City, with that in mind, the communication barrier isn't just across different languages, but clearly there can be massive barriers across different dialects of the same language to such an extent that other people sometimes will not understand you. They might they might think they hear what you say and have no idea what you actually said. Or they might think you said to do this, and you might actually think that you're supposed to do the opposite if it's like your boss or something. And it's one of the interesting things. And a lot of times it does cause frustration and tension in many environments where there are people from a variety of cultures, and they're speaking in different dialects, they're understanding in different dialects. It's often very confusing, which is why there was for a while the world had like the transatlantic English dialect. The transatlantic English dialect was an attempt, which worked for many years, to unify the various dialects of English across the world. And for a while it worked. Unfortunately, it's not still utilized. It had its own. There was an accent that people would learn. It wasn't. I don't think anyone had that as a native accent. I think it was an accent that was invented less organically, and that people would learn, so that people could communicate with a similar with the same accent and the same dialect across countries of English speakers, and they could all be unified in a language that could be heard through the accent and through the way the language was utilized, so that everyone could understand. They could understand the accent, and they could understand how the language was used, because it was kind of like a worldwide almost, or I think that was maybe the desire, unified dialect. And we don't have that anymore. We still rely on like individual national dialects of English to maybe convey things to wider groups of people. Some of us do. But even these days, our leaders often don't speak in the national standard of the English that is often so hyper important in academia and in science, in the sciences and communication there, and even in the sciences and academia. It's not national forms of English aren't always used. And it is interesting too to notice that there was a time not that long ago when we were attempting successfully a worldwide dialect, and in more recent years people have become even more divided, or even national dialects aren't really respected by our leaders anymore. There's a lot of misunderstanding between people because dialects are even more diversified. And I think there's a beauty in the diversity of dialects, but I also think that we can have our native dialects while also learning more unified forms of English, because our ability to communicate with other people across the world who speak our language is kind of pivotal. And not even kind of, it is pivotal. It is essential that we attempt to have some level of unification. But then again, I think about the Tower of Babel in the Tanakh, where it's like the unification of language can be a problem, because people can be very bad, people can be evil, and if we're too unified, we can come together and do some real damage. So sometimes separating the power by separating the language can actually be, I think, incredibly beneficial too. So it seems pivotal, but maybe it's not upon that lot of reflection. Because if there's too much power in unity, we hope that we can use unity for good, but too often, historically, unity has been used to hurt, torture, enslave, and do horrible, horrible, atrocious things. So sometimes I think sometimes it is better to have a bit of division. But at the same time, it doesn't take away from the frustration of not having unified modes of communication. A lot of many people, many people see mathematics as one of the unifying languages. And then, of course, like things like piano, or the harpsichord, or the violin, or the flute, or the variety. And there's a number of different types of flutes. But these, like certain musical instruments, certain forms of mathematics, maybe certain forms of computer programming, can be seen as very unifying because these are languages. And a lot of people have a misunderstanding of what a language is. Languages communicate things. Languages communicate things. Not always in the way that we think of traditionally, but they all communicate something. They tell us something. And they have their own way of telling us those things. Whether it's a nonverbal language, like sign languages, bonobos and chimpanzees have their forms of sign languages, which I assume they pass on from generation to generation, although some of it might be inherited knowledge. Prairie dogs and humans use verbal language. Verbal meaning that we speak them. We make sounds. Even in languages where you have things like clicking the tongue and things like that, that's a verbal language when you're making sounds. Those sounds might eventually incorporate physiological sounds as well, which I think is often categorized as body language, when you're making like sounds with your hands or on your knees, or you're maybe clicking your fingers or tapping your toes. That would often be associated with body language or physiological language. However, we could maybe make an argument that this is a form of verbal language when sound is, phonemes are intentionally produced. And but yeah, prairie dogs, they have their own words, they have their own sentence structures. There is a species of bird this one scientist has been studying for years and years, I think for more than a decade, or close to a decade at least. And this species of bird, they have different sounds for different things. They compose sentences vocally, so meaning they make the sounds. Sound language. It's very interesting. Language communicates something. So, if you take the piano and you make those sounds, you use those sounds just like I would use my word sounds out of my mouth, like right now. A person can use a piano to make word sounds and to make structured sounds, to compose communication, just like you would with your words coming from your mouth with those sounds. The sounds from a piano can be utilized in ways to communicate certain things, to intentionally prompt certain feelings, certain understandings, certain realizations about life. I was listening to, I think it was an orchestral piece, meaning it was from an orchestra, from a friend of mine. He had a bunch of phonographs, basically old record players, essentially. He had like one or two Edisons as well, which were also just other phonographs, which are also just older, I think better, but in many ways. But yeah, basically, you're talking about record players, in a sense. Basically. And the music was playing, and it was like going up. I think it went something like up and like kind of like happy, and then down and kind of like maybe more sad or reserved. And he had noticed something that had seemingly been communicated by that music, and he conveyed that to me. He was like, it's just like life. It's up and then it's down, and then it's up and then it's down. But see, that's the thing. If the people composing that music, or the person composing that music, had intended for that to be part of the realization from that music, then that is a language with intention and communication, which is, and how is that any different from the language I'm utilizing right now in my words? How is that any different? And then you have computer languages. Computer languages, if you've ever done computer programming, you use mathematics, which is a language, so it incorporates aspects of other languages. So you might be using things like algebra, which I used to use a lot when I used to computer programming, and then you would use, English words, maybe if you're naming a new variable that you want to, have for this function or that function, and you use if-then statements. So you use different forms. If you're using English, for the programming, it could be argued to be another sub-dialect of English, or dialect of English. And I would say computer programs in English, the programming languages, I would say the ones in English would be maybe constituting of a dialect of English with various programming tools being different programming languages being subdialects, and then like you have like basic computer programming. Well, those languages, there's a bunch of them. So then you have subdialects. Well, how's that any different from like the languages in English, the dialects of English I was talking about before? With you have the language, you have the dialects, you have the subdialects, the subdialects, and you might be able to go even further. The divisions aren't always neat, but they often, at least in a sense, in our limited comprehension, exist. And give me 1 second, if you would. Mathematics. So if we're using written English for mathematics, think about things like algebra. You use English words all the time for algebra. You could use words from any language, which is interesting, because you could use like alpha, you could use aleph, you could use alif, you could use zed, zeta, agis. You could use any letter from any language. You could use any word from any language, and people would understand it from any language on some level, at least what's being communicated. Like if you said Gato equals Myanmar plus 25 divided by 40 to the 30th power. You can communicate massive and incredible things through things like algebra, and also through other forms of mathematics. And how is it different from music or our tradition, our quote-unquote traditional languages, and so on and so forth, our programming languages? How's it different? You're utilizing something that's either viewable or hearable, or somehow something that is perceived or can be perceived by the senses, is being applied in intentional ways to communicate something with meaning. I would actually say that's probably a very good way to define language as a whole. Utilizing something that can be perceived by the senses, doesn't even have to be human senses, but utilizing something that can be perceived by the senses with intention to communicate meaning, to convey something from your soul, from your nefesh, your soul, to somebody else, to break that barrier between consciousnesses, to break through those doors and give them a part of yourself, to break into somebody else's house and give them something from your house, is kind of what language is at its core. You're knocking at their door and waiting for them to open the door, and then you give them your gift from your house, and then they take it and they look at it and they observe it and they try to understand what the gift means, and then the interaction is done. Oftentimes, sometimes it's shorter, sometimes it's longer. And that's what's good. That's kind of a good metaphor, I think. You go to their door and you knock. You wait for them to open the door. You give them the gift from your house, and then you leave. And then both go back to your respective houses and shut your doors. That is language. That is communication. You are giving something from your soul, whether shallow or profound, regardless of the depth. You are giving something from your soul to someone else. And we have to be careful because our souls often seem to have some shady areas and some brilliant areas. So it's often, I think, important to remember when we're imparting something from our soul to another soul, to be careful what part of us we give out. But that is language as a whole. I have so much of my soul, and no one will ever truly know my soul, but I can try to give the shadow of something within my soul to someone else, and maybe something within their soul will recognize something within themselves that might not be 100% equivalent. It might not be a one-for-one match, but it might be close enough to where you can see some murky image of my soul through that interaction. That is language. That's why music is a language. Mathematics, computer programming, vocal language, like what I'm doing right now. Non-verbal, physiological body languages, and so on and so forth. These are all languages. The written language, and so on and so forth. Yeah, this is essentially is how I would define language, which, again, one more time, is utilizing something with intention, and that something must be perceivable by the senses. But utilizing and applying that something with intention to convey meaning from within one soul to another, imparting something from one soul to another. And in many traditions, the way that the soul is defined is very different from the largely ancient Greek influenced understanding that many Westerners have today. And in the culture of my people, it was largely the entirety of the person. The soul was not just consciousness, not just the mind, not just the body, not just something special, invisible inside the body. It's my understanding that their understanding of the soul was the entirety, all of those things and more, potentially. And in the culture of my people, and you don't have to agree with this, but in the culture of my people, it seems that the soul, the nefesh, is typically attributed to more than just human beings. And I already pointed out that there are other non-human animals who utilize vocal language and compose sentences with the words they have. These studies, I think the prairie dogs have been studied, I think, since around the 50s. The bird species I mentioned, I think that was a more recent study within the last 20 years. But these studies show that people haven't even studied these kinds of phenomena in the majority of other living things, of other animals, of other organisms. If we actually spent 20, 30 years observing the different sounds that, say, the goats make or the horses make, would we see sentence structure? Would we see syntax? Would we see grammar? Would we see dialectical differences, different dialects? Would we see different accents and so forth? If we really took the time to really spend decades observing these animals and observing what sounds they make and what seems to prompt those sounds, what are they observing, what are they hearing, and so forth, and seeing when those sounds are repeated, what's the common variable? Do they make this particular sound every time that there's a snake nearby? And do we see other sounds associated with that sound that might indicate sentence structure and so on and so forth? So vocal language, we already know, at least in the case of 3 species, humans, prairie dogs, and 1 species of bird. At least so far, from my understanding, I don't know if there's any other studies into this that have been in academia, academic studies, studies that are trusted and respected. I don't know if any other species have been observed when it comes to vocal language. But at least those 3 species do. We do, 1 species of bird, and at least, and we know prairie dogs. As far as sign language, humans use that. Bonobos, chimpanzees. I think orangutans might too, but I could be wrong about this, but I think it's my understanding that bonobos and chimpanzees might have some instinctual knowledge of how to use their sign languages, whereas I think orangutans are more likely to learn it from their parents and from their communities, and/or from their communities. But I could be wrong on that assessment. I see a lot of my friends left. Yeah, I did think that once I started talking about souls and from my cultural perspective and the fish, a lot of people would leave. A lot of people throughout my life are very opposed. They have aversion to that kind of speak. When I was in elementary school, I loved that. Learning about the cultures of the Native Americans, learning about that was one of my favorites. Learning about Indian cultures as I got older. I love learning about these things because people often associate these theological, cultural values with the idea that there has to be alignment of belief, 100% on religious belief, or we can't be friends, and we can't garner or gather value from one another, and that's just simply not true. One of my best friends is a Muslim, and I am a Jewish man. Just putting that out there. We don't have to agree on everything to have love, respect, and the knowledge that we can learn from one another. But especially young people often, even if they know that is true, I think they intentionally decide not to heed that truth. Which to me is a bit sad. But now we're getting